fire that consumed the Harrow Plantation on the night of August 14th, 1008, 159 burned so hot that witnesses claimed they could see the glow from 12 miles away. By dawn, nothing remained but ash and the skeletal frames of 3 buildings. 17 people died that night, 16 enslaved workers, and 1 white overseer. The official report, filed by the county sheriff, 3 days later, attributed the blaze to an overturned lantern in the tobacco barn. But the enslaved survivors told a different story, one they whispered only among themselves, one that involved a young deaf man named Thomas, a cruel overseer named Virgil Crenshaw, and a series of events so calculated, so methodical that even today, historians who study the incident can't agree on what truly happened. What they do agree on is this: someone planned that fire, someone wanted those people dead, and someone walked away without a single burn mark on their body. Before we continue with the story of Thomas and the night that changed everything, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from the South or anywhere in America where these old plantations still stand, leave a comment telling me what state you're from. These stories are part of our history, uncomfortable as they are. And I want to know where you're hearing this from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because the story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, revenge, and survival. Now, let's go back to Virginia in 1008, 159, to a place where cruelty was law and silence became the deadliest weapon of all. The Harrow Plantation sat in the Tidewater region of Virginia, about 40 miles south of Richmond, in a county where the James River split into dozens of smaller tributaries that fed the marshlands and tobacco fields. It was old Virginia country settled in the early 1700s by English families who had come seeking fortune in the New World. By 1859, the land had been worked for over a century, the soil depleted in some places, still rich in others. A patchwork of productivity that determined which families prospered and which slowly declined into Gentile poverty. The Harrow family fell somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. They weren't wealthy like the Randolphs or the Carters, who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people, but they weren't poor either. Edmund Hargrove's grandfather had purchased the land in 1732, with money earned from a shipping business in Norfolk. He had built the main house himself, or rather had supervised the enslaved workers who built it, a modest two-story structure of brick and wood, painted white, with a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning sun and the evening breeze from the river. The plantation itself was about 300 acres, with roughly half of that under cultivation at any given time. The rest was left or used for timber, or simply allowed to return to the pine forests and marshlands that had covered the region before the Europeans arrived. The main crop was tobacco, though they also grew corn, wheat, and vegetables in smaller plots near the slave quarters. There was an orchard of apple and peach trees behind the main house, and a small vineyard that Edmund's father had planted in a fit of optimism that had never quite paid off. The grapes grew, but they were sour and thin-skinned, better suited for vinegar than wine. In 1859, the plantation was worked by 23 enslaved people, ranging in age from 6 to 62. They lived in 6 cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the tobacco barns. Each cabin housing 3 to 5 people depending on family size. The cabins were built of rough honeyed logs chinked with mud and moss, with dirt floors that turned to mud when it rained, and wooden shutters instead of glass windows. Each cabin had a single fireplace for cooking and heat, and a loft where the children slept on straw mattresses. The enslaved community at Hargrove Plantation was relatively stable compared to some others in the region. Edmund Hargrove was not in the habit of selling people away from their families unless he was in dire financial straits, which he had been only once in 1851, when a bad tobacco crop and some poor investments had forced him to sell 3 young men to a trader heading to the deep south. The memory of that sale still haunted the quarters, the sound of the mother's wailing, the sight of the men being chained together and led away down the road toward Richmond. It had been a reminder, if anyone needed one, that their lives were not their own, that they could be torn apart at any moment by forces beyond their control. But for the most part, life at Harrow Plantation followed a predictable rhythm. The work was hard. Tobacco was a demanding crop, requiring constant attention from planting in April through harvest in September. But it was no harder than on neighboring plantations. The food rations were adequate if monotonous: cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and whatever vegetables people could grow in their own small garden plots. The clothing allowance came twice a year in spring and fall. 2 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 jacket, 1 pair of shoes for the men, 2 dresses, 1 shawl, 1 pair of shoes for the women. Children got hand-me-downs until they were old enough to work in the fields. Edmund Hargrove himself was a widower in his late 50s, a man whose wife had died in childbirth 20 years earlier, along with the infant son who would have been his only heir. He had never remarried, perhaps because he had loved his wife deeply, or perhaps because he had simply lost interest in the complications of domestic life. He spent most of his time in Richmond, where he had a townhouse on Gray Street and a seat on the board of directors of a small bank. He came to the plantation once a month, sometimes less, to review the accounts and inspect the crops. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time and place, but neither was he particularly kind. He saw slavery as an economic system, a necessary evil perhaps, but necessary nonetheless. He treated the enslaved people on his plantation the way he treated his horses and his farm equipment, as valuable property that needed to be maintained in working order. The day-to-day management of the plantation fell to the overseer, and for 2 years before Virgil Crenshaw arrived, that overseer had been a man named William Porter, a local farmer's son who was competent but unambitious. Porter had kept things running smoothly enough, but the tobacco yields had been declining steadily, and Edmund Hargrove had grown frustrated. In the spring of 1857, he dismissed Porter and hired Crenshaw on the recommendation of a planter in the next county who wanted to be rid of him, but was too polite to say so directly. Virgil Crenshaw was 32 years old when he arrived at Harrow Plantation, a tall, lean man with pale blue eyes and a face that seemed incapable of smiling. He had been born in North Carolina, the youngest son of a small farmer who had lost his land to debt when Crenshaw was 15. He had worked his way up from field hand to overseer over the course of 15 years, moving from plantation to plantation across Virginia and the Corollas, never staying in one place for more than 2 years. There was always a reason for the moves: a dispute with the owner, an incident with the enslaved workers, a sudden need to find employment elsewhere. But the pattern was clear to anyone who looked closely. Crenshaw was a man who left destruction in his wake. He had a reputation among the enslaved communities of the region, a reputation that traveled faster than he did, carried by the networks of communication that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. The whispered conversations at Sunday markets, the messages passed along by traveling preachers and hired-out workers, the songs that encoded warnings and information in their lyrics. The reputation said that Crenshaw was a man who enjoyed his work too much, who took pleasure in the exercise of power, who saw the enslaved people under his control not as human beings, but as animals to be broken and trained. When he arrived at Harrow Plantation in April 1857, he spent the first week simply observing. He walked the fields, inspected the barns and outbuildings, reviewed the plantation records, and most importantly, he watched the people. He noted who worked hard and who slacked off, who had influence in the quarters and who was isolated, who had family ties that could be exploited and who had none. He was methodical in his observations, taking mental notes that he would later use to construct a system of control based on fear, manipulation, and strategic violence. His first official act as overseer was to call a meeting of all the enslaved workers on a Sunday afternoon. They gathered in the yard between the tobacco barns, men and women and children standing in the spring sunshine, while Crenshaw stood on the porch of his cottage and addressed them. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that made people's skin crawl. "My name is Virgil Crenshaw," he said, "and I am the new overseer of this plantation. I want to make a few things clear from the start. I don't care what the rules were before I got here. Those rules are gone. From now on, you follow my rules, and my rules are simple. You work hard, you work fast, and you don't give me any trouble. If you do those 3 things, we'll get along." "Fine. If you don't, you'll regret it. I don't make idle threats, and I don't give second chances. Do we understand each other?" No one answered. They just stood there, silent and weary, knowing that any response could be interpreted as insolence. Crenshaw smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Now get back to your cabins. Tomorrow we start fresh." That night, in the privacy of their cabins, the enslaved people of Harrow Plantation talked in low voices about the new overseer. They had all seen men like him before, men who wore their cruelty like a badge of honor. They knew what was coming: the increased work quotas, the arbitrary punishments, the atmosphere of constant surveillance and fear. What they didn't know yet was just how far Crenshaw would go, or how long they would have to endure him. Within 6 months, Crenshaw had transformed the plantation. He reorganized the work schedules, dividing the enslaved workers into gangs based on age and strength, and assigning each gang specific tasks with specific quotas that had to be met each day. He implemented a system of punishments for anyone who failed to meet their quota. Reduced food rations, extra work assignments, confinement in the plantation jail, a small windowless shed behind the overseer's cottage. For more serious infractions, talking back, attempting to run away, striking another enslaved person, the punishments were more severe. Though Crenshaw was careful never to damage anyone so badly that they couldn't work, he understood that his value to Edmund Hargrove lay in his ability to extract maximum labor while minimizing financial loss. But Crenshaw's real genius, if it could be called that, lay not in physical violence, but in psychological manipulation. He had a talent for identifying each person's vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical precision. He knew who had children they would do anything to protect, who had a sweetheart they couldn't bear to see hurt, who had pride that could be broken, who had hope that could be crushed. He used this knowledge to create a climate of fear and mistrust where people were afraid to help each other, afraid to show weakness, afraid to do anything that might draw his attention. One of his favorite tactics was to pit people against each other. He would tell one person that another had informed on them, whether it was true or not, and then watch as suspicion and resentment tore apart friendships and family bonds. He would give small privileges to certain individuals, an extra ration of food, a lighter work assignment, permission to visit a spouse on a neighboring plantation, and then make sure everyone else knew about it, creating jealousy and division. He would punish entire groups for the actions of one person, forcing people to police each other out of fear of collective punishment. The tobacco yields increased dramatically under Cower's management. In his first full year, 1858, the plantation produced 30% more tobacco than it had the year before. Edmund Hargrove was pleased. He gave Crenshaw a bonus and told him to keep up the good work. He didn't ask about the methods Crenal used to achieve those results. He didn't want to know, but there was one person on the plantation that Crenal couldn't quite figure out. One person who seemed immune to his usual tactics. One person who watched him with eyes that showed neither fear nor defiance, just a patient, calculating awareness. That person was Thomas. Thomas had been born on the Harrow Plantation in the spring of 1841, the son of a woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house as a cook. His father was unknown. Ruth had never said, and no one had ever asked. In the world of slavery, paternity was often a dangerous subject, one that could lead to violence, separation, or worse. What mattered was that Thomas was Ruth's son, and she loved him with a fierce protective intensity that had only grown stronger over the years. Thomas had been deaf from birth, the result of a fever Ruth had suffered during the last months of her pregnancy. She had been working in the kitchen of the main house, standing over a hot stove in the middle of July when she had collapsed. The plantation's doctor, a white man from Richmond who visited once a month, had diagnosed her with heat exhaustion and prescribed rest. But Ruth couldn't afford to rest. She had a job to do, and if she didn't do it, she would be replaced. So she had gone back to work the next day, and the day after that, and the fever had persisted low and constant until Thomas was born 6 weeks later. He had been a small baby, quiet and still, and for the first few days Ruth had been terrified that he was going to die. But he had survived, growing stronger each day until it became clear that he was healthy in every way except one. He couldn't hear. Ruth had noticed it first when he was about 3 months old. He didn't startle at loud noises. He didn't turn his head when she called his name. He didn't cry when the other babies in the quarters were crying. At first, she had hoped she was wrong, that he was just a calm baby, but by the time he was 6 months old, there was no denying it. Thomas was deaf. In some places, sometimes, a deaf child might have been seen as a burden, someone who couldn't contribute to the work of the plantation, and therefore had no value. But Ruth was valuable. She was an excellent cook, and Edmund Harrow's father had relied on her to prepare meals for important guests, and so Thomas was allowed to live, to grow up in the quarters like any other child. Ruth made sure he learned to work, to be useful, so that no one could say he was worthless. As a young child, Thomas had developed his own system of communication. He couldn't hear words, but he could see faces, rides, understand gestures. He and Ruth created a language of signs between them, simple at first, pointing, nodding, shaking heads, but growing more complex as Thomas got older. By the time he was 5, they could have entire conversations using nothing but their hands and faces. Other people in the quarters learned some of the signs too, enough to communicate basic information. And Thomas learned to read lips with remarkable accuracy, watching people's mouths move and understanding what they were saying, even though he couldn't hear the sounds. His deafness had shaped his life in unexpected ways. Because he couldn't hear orders being shouted across the fields, he had been assigned to work closer to the main buildings, in the tobacco barns, the curing sheds, the carpenter's shop, the blacksmith's forge. This meant he was often alone or working with just 1 or 2 other people, which gave him a degree of independence unusual for an enslaved person. It also meant he was often present during conversations that people assumed he couldn't understand. White people especially tended to talk freely around him, assuming that because he was deaf, he was also stupid, or at least incapable of comprehending what was being said. They were wrong. Thomas had learned over the years to be very still and very observant. He watched people's faces when they talked, read their lips, noted their body language, their tone. Even though he couldn't hear the tone, he could see it in the tension of their shoulders, the set of their jaws, the way their hands moved. He learned things that other enslaved people never learned, secrets that were spoken aloud in his presence because people forgot he was there or assumed he couldn't understand. By the time he was 18, in the summer of 1859, Thomas was a young man of medium height, with his mother's high cheekbones and dark eyes, and a build that was lean but strong from years of physical labor. He had his mother's intelligence, too, and a quality that was harder to define, a kind of patient watchfulness, an ability to wait and observe and think before acting. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it transformed his face entirely, making him look younger and more vulnerable than he usually appeared. Virgil Crenshaw had tried in his first months at the plantation to break Thomas the way he broke everyone else. He had assigned him impossible tasks, moving a pile of bricks from one side of the yard to the other, then back again, for no reason except to demonstrate his power. He had withheld Thomas's food rations, claiming the young man had been stealing from the kitchen house, even though everyone knew it wasn't true. He had threatened to sell Ruth to a plantation in Georgia, knowing that the threat of separation was one of the most powerful weapons an overseer could wield, but Thomas had simply endured. He had moved the bricks, all of them, twice, without complaint. He had gone without food for 3 days without showing any sign of weakness, and when Crenshaw had threatened to sell his mother, Thomas had looked him directly in the eye with an expression that was neither defiant nor submissive, just watchful, patient, waiting. It had unnerved Crenshaw in a way he didn't fully understand. There was something about the young man's silence, about the way he seemed to observe everything without reacting, that made the overseer feel exposed, as if Thomas could see through all his tactics and strategies to the insecure, violent man beneath. Crenshaw had dealt with defiance before. He knew how to crush it, but Thomas wasn't defiant. He was something else entirely. He was calculating, and that made him dangerous. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late July during the hottest part of the summer. The temperature had been above 90 degrees for a week straight, and the air was thick with humidity that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything except endure. The tobacco plants in the fields were wilting despite regular watering, and the enslaved workers moved slowly through their tasks, conserving energy, trying not to collapse from heat exhaustion. Thomas was working in the tobacco barn that afternoon, hanging leaves to cure. It was hot work. The barn was like an oven, the air inside even hotter than outside, thick with the sweet cloying smell of tobacco, but Thomas preferred it to working in the fields. In the barn, he could work at his own pace, and he was usually alone, which meant he didn't have to worry about Crenal watching him, criticizing him, finding fault with everything he did. He was standing on a ladder near the back of the barn, reaching up to hang a bundle of tobacco leaves on one of the high racks, when he saw movement near the door. He glanced down and saw Crenal enter the barn, followed by a woman named Sarah. Sarah was 19 years old, the daughter of the plantation's blacksmith, a man named Jacob, who was one of the most respected members of the enslaved community. Sarah had inherited her father's strength and his quiet dignity. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly swollen beneath the loose dress she wore, and she moved with the careful, deliberate gait of a woman carrying a heavy burden. Her husband, Daniel, worked in the fields and wouldn't return until sunset. Thomas watched as Crenshaw closed the barn door behind them. There was something about the way the overseer moved, something about the expression on his face that made Thomas's stomach tighten with apprehension. He stayed very still on the ladder, partially hidden by the hanging tobacco leaves, and watched. Crenshaw said something to Sarah. Thomas couldn't see his lips clearly from this angle, but he could see Sarah's face, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. She looked frightened. She took a step backward toward the door, but Crenshaw moved to block her path. Crenshaw said something else, and this time Thomas could see his lips well enough to understand some of the words. "Been watching you time you showed some gratitude. Light work because of your condition." Sarah shook her head, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly. She said something. Thomas couldn't see her lips because her back was partially turned. But whatever it was, it made Cole angry. Jaw. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough that Thomas could see her WSE. Thomas didn't think, he simply acted. He climbed down from the ladder as quietly as he could, his feet finding the rungs by memory, his eyes never leaving Crenna and Sarah. When he reached the ground, he walked across the barn floor, his footsteps silent on the packed dirt, and tapped Crenna on the shoulder. Crenna spun around, startled, his hand still gripping Sarah's arm. For a moment, the three of them stood there in the dusty light of the barn, the overseer, the pregnant woman, and the deaf young man who had just interrupted something that could have ended very badly for Sarah. Thomas pointed to the ladder, then to the tobacco leaves hanging from the racks, then to Crenna. His meaning was clear. He needed help with the work. It was a lie, of course. Thomas didn't need help, but it gave Sarah the opportunity to slip away, which she did, pulling her arm free from Crenna's grip and walking quickly toward the door. She didn't look back. Crenna stared at Thomas for a long moment, his pale blue eyes cold with fury. Then he smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in close, so close that Thomas could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the fine lines around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw. He said something, speaking slowly and clearly so that Thomas could read his lips. "You just made a mistake, boy, a big one, and I'm going to make sure you regret it for the rest of your short life." Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there, his face expressionless, his eyes meeting without flinching. After a moment, Crenshaw turned and walked out of the barn, leaving Thomas alone in the heat and the silence. That night, Sarah came to Ruth's cabin. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she signed to Thomas, thanking him for what he had done. Ruth held her while she cried, and Thomas sat on the floor near the fireplace, watching the flames and thinking about what was going to happen next. He knew Crenna wouldn't let this go. Men like Crenna never did. They couldn't afford to let anyone challenge their authority, even in the smallest way, because their power depended on fear, and fear depended on the certainty that resistance would always be punished. Thomas was right. Over the next 3 weeks, Crenna made good on his promise. The persecution began the very next day. Thomas was assigned to clean out the well, a job that was both dangerous and disgusting. The well was about 30 ft deep, lined with stones that were slippery with moss and algae. At the bottom there was about 3 ft of water, and beneath that, a layer of mud and debris that had accumulated over the years, dead leaves, animal carcasses, broken tools, things that had fallen in and never been retrieved. The water had started to taste bad, and Edmund Hargrove had ordered it cleaned before his next visit. Thomas was lowered into the well in a wooden bucket with a rope tied around his waist in case he fell. The air at the bottom was cold and damp and smelled of rot. He worked for hours scooping mud and debris into buckets that were hauled up to the surface, his hands numb from the cold water, his back aching from bending over in the confined space. When he finally emerged at sunset, he was covered in filth and shivering despite the summer heat. The next day, Crenshaw assigned him to repair the roof of the tobacco barn. It was dangerous work, made more dangerous by the heat. The tin roof was hot enough to burn skin, and the pitch was steep enough that one wrong step could send a person tumbling to the ground 20 ft below. Thomas worked carefully, replacing broken shingles, sealing gaps with tar, trying not to think about how easy it would be to fall, how convenient it would be for Crenna if he did. The day after that, he was assigned to haul 100 B sacks of grain from the storage shed to the mill, a distance of about half a mile. He made the trip 20 times, carrying the sacks on his back, his shoulders screaming with pain, his legs trembling with exhaustion. By the end of the day, he could barely walk. And through it all, Crenshaw watched him with those cold blue eyes, waiting for him to break, to complain, to give him an excuse to escalate the punishment. But Thomas never did. He completed every task, no matter how difficult, no matter how dangerous, without a word of protest. He endured. But Crenshaw wasn't satisfied with just working Thomas to exhaustion. He wanted to break him psychologically as well. He started cutting Thomas's food rations, claiming the young man had been stealing from the kitchen house. It wasn't true. Ruth would never have allowed her son to steal, and everyone in the quarters knew it. But Crenshaw didn't care about the truth. He cared about power, about demonstrating that he could take away even the most basic necessities of life on a whim. Thomas's rations were cut in half. Instead of a pound of cornmeal and a quarter pound of salt pork each day, he received half a pound of cornmeal and no meat at all. Ruth tried to share her own food with him, but Thomas refused. He knew that if Crenshaw found out, Ruth would be punished too. And he couldn't bear the thought of his mother suffering because of him. He grew thinner, his face becoming gaunt, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. But he kept working, kept enduring, kept watching Crenshaw with that patient, calculating gaze that made the overseer increasingly uneasy. The other enslaved people watched this persecution with a mixture of sympathy and fear. They knew what Thomas had done. Word had spread quickly through the quarters about how he had saved Sarah from Crenshaw's advances. They admired his courage, but they also feared for him. They knew that Crenshaw was the kind of man who would never stop, who would keep pushing and pushing until Thomas either broke or died. And they knew that interfering would only make things worse for Thomas and for themselves. Sarah in particular was consumed with guilt. She knew that Thomas was suffering because of her, because he had protected her. She wanted to do something to help him, but she didn't know what. Her husband Daniel was furious when he learned what had happened, but he was also terrified. He knew that if he confronted Crenshaw, he would be killed, and then what would happen to Sarah and their unborn child? Jacob, Sarah's father, was more pragmatic. He was a man in his 50s, a skilled blacksmith who had been on the plantation since he was a teenager. He had seen overseers come and go, had seen good men and bad men, and he had learned that the key to survival was to keep your head down, do your work, and wait for things to change. Overseers never lasted forever. Sooner or later, they moved on, or they were fired, or they died. The key was to survive long enough to see them go. But even Jacob was worried about Thomas. The young man was strong, but everyone had a breaking point, and Crenshaw seemed determined to find Thomas. 3 weeks after the incident in the tobacco barn, Crenshaw escalated his campaign. He announced that Thomas would be whipped for insubordination. The charge was absurd. Thomas had never said a word to Crenshaw, had never done anything but complete every task assigned to him. But Crenshaw didn't need a real reason. He just needed an excuse. The whipping was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the yard between the tobacco barns where everyone could see. It was meant to be a lesson, a demonstration of what happened to people who challenged Crenshaw's authority, even in the smallest way. Ruth was beside herself with fear and rage. She went to the main house and begged Edmund Harrove, who was visiting for the weekend, to intervene, but Harrove refused. He told her that Crenshaw was the overseer and that discipline was Shaw's responsibility. He didn't want to undermine his overseer's authority by interfering. Ruth left the main house in tears, knowing that there was nothing she could do to stop what was about to happen. But on Saturday morning, something unexpected occurred. Crenshaw woke up with a fever. It came on suddenly, violently. One moment he was fine, the next he was burning up, shivering despite the summer heat, his head pounding, his stomach churning. He spent the day in bed, too sick to get up, too sick to carry out the whipping he had planned. By Sunday the fever had broken and Crenshaw was feeling better, but he was also confused. He couldn't understand where the fever had come from or why it had disappeared so quickly. He suspected that someone had poisoned him, but he had no proof, and he didn't know who would have had the opportunity. What he didn't know was that Ruth had slipped a small amount of ipac root into his coffee on Friday night. It was a plant that grew wild in the woods near the plantation, and Ruth knew how to prepare it. Her own mother had taught her years ago how to use plants for medicine and other purposes. The ipac had made Crenshaw violently ill, but it hadn't killed him. Ruth had been careful about the dosage. She didn't want to kill him. That would have brought too much attention, too many questions. She just wanted to buy Thomas a little more time, but time was running out. Crenshaw was more determined than ever to break Thomas, and he was starting to suspect that someone in the quarters was working against him. He increased his surveillance, watching people more closely, looking for signs of conspiracy, of resistance. The atmosphere on the plantation became even more oppressive, more suffocating. People were afraid to talk to each other, afraid to meet each other's eyes, afraid of being accused of something they hadn't done. And Thomas, in the midst of all this, was changing. The other enslaved people could see it, in the way he moved, in the way he looked at Crennel when the overseer's back was turned. There was a coldness in Thomas's eyes now, a calculation that hadn't been there before. He was no longer just enduring, he was planning. Ruth was the first to notice the change in her son. She had always been able to read Thomas better than anyone else. She had raised him, taught him, protected him for 18 years. She knew his moods, his thoughts, his fears, and she knew with a mother's instinct that something had shifted inside him. It was a Sunday evening in mid-August, about 3 weeks after the incident in the tobacco barn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and the air was finally cooling after another scorching day. Ruth found Thomas sitting outside his cabin, staring across the yard at the overseer's cottage. There was something about the intensity of his gaze, the stillness of his body that made her uneasy. She sat down beside him on the wooden step and took his hand. For a moment they just sat there in silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Then Ruth turned Thomas's face toward hers and signed to him, using the gestures they had developed together over the years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he signed back, his movements equally slow and deliberate. "Fire," he said. "I'm thinking about fire." Ruth felt a chill run through her despite the warm evening air. She knew her son. She knew he wasn't speaking metaphorically. She knew that when Thomas said he was thinking about fire, he meant it literally. "Don't," she signed, her hands shaking slightly. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." "They'll kill you," Thomas shook his head. "They'll kill me anyway," he signed. "Crenshaw won't stop until I'm dead or broken." You know that Ruth wanted to argue, but she couldn't. She had seen too many people broken by men like Crenshaw. She had seen too many people die from overwork, from punishment, from despair, and she knew her son was right. Crenshaw wouldn't stop. Men like him never did. They couldn't afford to, because their power depended on fear. And fear depended on the certainty that resistance would always be punished, always be crushed. "What are you going to do?" She signed, though she was afraid of the answer. Thomas looked back at the overseer's cottage. Lamplight was beginning to glow in the windows. Crennel was inside, probably eating his dinner, probably drinking his whiskey, probably planning new torments for tomorrow. "I don't know yet," Thomas signed. "But I'll think of something." Over the next few days, Thomas did think of something. He thought about it constantly, turning the idea over in his mind, examining it from every angle, looking for flaws, for risks, for ways it could go wrong. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that what he was contemplating was not just dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic. But he also realized that he had no other choice. Crenshaw had to be stopped, and there was no one else who could do it. The law wouldn't protect him. Edmund Hargrove wouldn't protect him. The other enslaved people couldn't protect him without putting themselves at risk. He was alone in this, and that meant he had to act alone. The plan that took shape in Thomas's mind was simple in its essence, but complex in its execution. Crenshaw had to die. That much was clear, but it couldn't look like murder. It had to look like an accident, something that would bring no suspicion on Thomas or anyone else. And it had to happen in a way that would make it impossible to prove otherwise. Fire was the answer. Fire was common on plantations. Lanterns overturned, sparks from the forge, lightning strikes during summer. Storms, spontaneous combustion in tobacco barns where the leaves were curing, a fire in the tobacco barn wouldn't be unusual, and if Crenshaw happened to be inside when it started, if he happened to be trapped, if he happened to die, well, that would be a tragedy but not a crime. The problem was getting Crenshaw into the barn at the right time and making sure the fire spread quickly enough that he couldn't escape. Thomas thought about this for days, watching Crenshaw's routines, noting when he made his rounds, when he was alone, when he was vulnerable. He also thought about consequences. If his plan worked, Crenshaw would die and Thomas would be free of him. But 17 other people worked and lived on this plantation, and a fire in the tobacco barn could easily spread to the other buildings. Thomas didn't want to hurt innocent people. He didn't want to destroy the home and livelihoods of the people he had grown up with, but he also didn't see any other way. Crenshaw had to be stopped, and this was the only method that had any chance of success. He decided that he would set the fire late at night when most people were asleep, and he would make sure it started in a way that would give people time to escape if it spread beyond the barn. It wasn't a perfect plan. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong, but it was the best he could come up with. What Thomas didn't know was that he wasn't the only person on the plantation thinking about fire. There was a man named Marcus, about 30 years old, who worked in the fields. Marcus had been on the plantation for 5 years, having been sold there from a plantation in North Carolina after his previous owner died. He was a quiet man, reserved, someone who kept to himself and didn't make friends easily. But he was also someone who paid attention, who noticed things, who understood the dynamics of power and resistance. Marcus had been watching Thomas's persecution with interest. He had seen how the young deaf man had endured everything Crenshaw threw at him, how he had never broken, never complained, never given the overseer the satisfaction of seeing him suffer. Marcus admired that. He also recognized something in Thomas that he recognized in himself, a willingness to do what needed to be done regardless of the cost. Marcus had his own reasons for hating Sish. The overseer had taken a particular dislike to him, for reasons Marcus didn't fully understand. Maybe it was because Marcus was strong and capable and didn't show fear. Maybe it was because Marcus had once worked on a plantation where the overseer had been killed by the enslaved workers, and Crenshaw suspected that Marcus had been involved. Whatever the reason, Crenshaw had made Marcus' life miserable, assigning him the hardest work, cutting his rations, threatening to have him sold away from the woman he loved, a woman named Esther, who worked in the main house. Marcus had been thinking about killing Cure for months. He had considered various methods, poison, a knife in the dark, an accident in the fields, but all of these methods had one fatal flaw. They would be obviously murder, and Marcus would be the obvious suspect. He would be caught, tried, and executed, and Esther would be left alone. But then Marcus had noticed Thomas staring at the tobacco barn, and he had seen the look in the young man's eyes, and he had understood. Thomas was planning something, and whatever it was, it involved fire. Marcus decided to wait and watch. If Thomas's plan worked, Crenshaw would die, and Marcus wouldn't have to risk his own life. If it didn't work, well, Marcus would have to come up with his own plan, but for now, he would wait. There was also a woman named Hannah, about 25 years old, who worked in the kitchen house with Ruth. Hannah had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a woman who had died when Hannah was 12. She had grown up alongside Thomas, and she had always felt protective of him, the way an older sister might feel protective of a younger brother. She had watched his persecution with growing anger and fear, and she had started to think about what she could do to help him. Hannah didn't know about Thomas's plan. She didn't know about Marcus's interest, but she had her own ideas about how to deal with Crenshaw, and those ideas also involved fire. She had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since she had seen Crenshaw corner Sarah in the tobacco barn. Hannah had been walking past the barn that day on her way to the main house with a basket of vegetables, and she had heard Sarah's voice, frightened and pleading. She had wanted to intervene, but she had been too afraid, and then Thomas had appeared, and Sarah had escaped, and Hannah had felt both relief and shame. Relief that Sarah was safe, shamed that she hadn't been brave enough to help. Since then, Hannah had been thinking about fire. She knew that the tobacco barn was full of dry, flammable material. She knew that a fire there would spread quickly, would be almost impossible to stop. She knew that if Crenna was inside when it started, he would die, and she knew that no one would suspect her because she was just a kitchen worker, someone who had no reason to be near the tobacco barn, no opportunity to set a fire. But Hannah didn't know how to start a fire without being seen. She didn't know how to make it look like an accident. She was still working on the details when Thomas put his own plan into motion. On the evening of August 13th, Thomas saw his opportunity. Crenshaw had been drinking. This wasn't unusual. The overseer often drank in the evenings, sitting on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, watching the enslaved people return from the fields, making notes in a small leather-bound book he always carried. But on this particular evening, he had been drinking more than usual. Thomas, working late in the carpenter's shop, had watched him stumble slightly as he walked back into his cottage around 9:00. Thomas waited until the plantation was quiet, until the last lamps had been extinguished in the slave cabins and the main house. Edmund Hargrove was in Richmond, as he usually was during the week, which meant there was no one in the main house except for 2 elderly women who kept it clean and prepared meals for Hargrove when he visited. They would be asleep by now in their cabin behind the kitchen house. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over the yard and the buildings. Thomas could see clearly as he walked across the yard to the tobacco barn, his footsteps silent on the packed earth. He had done this walk 1,000 times, knew every rut and stone, every shadow and sound, but tonight felt different. Tonight he was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He reached the barn and pulled open the door. The hinges creaked slightly, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Thomas froze, listening, but there was no response, no sign that anyone had heard. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The barn was dark, but Thomas's eyes adjusted quickly. Moonlight filtered through the gaps in wooden walls, creating stripes of silver light across the floor. The smell of tobacco was overwhelming, sweet and cloying, mixed with the smell of dust and old wood. Thousands of tobacco leaves hung from racks suspended from the ceiling, drying in the warm air, rustling slightly in the breeze that came through the gaps in the walls. Thomas moved through the barn with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours here. He knew where every tool was kept, where every pile of supplies was stored, where every potential hazard lay. He made his way to the back of the barn to the storage area where Crenna kept tools, rope, and other supplies. The storage area was cluttered and disorganized, full of things that had been thrown there and forgotten. Old rags soaked in oil, dried straw that had been used for packing, broken pieces of wood, empty barrels, coils of rope. It was a fire hazard, and everyone knew it, but no one had bothered to clean it up. Crenna didn't care about safety. He cared about productivity. Thomas worked quickly and quietly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He gathered the oil-soaked rags and piled them against the back wall beneath one of the main support beams of the barn. He scattered straw around them, creating a bed of kindling. He positioned broken pieces of wood in a way that would create a chimney effect, drawing the flames upward toward the dried tobacco leaves hanging above. He was creating a fire that would start slowly but spread quickly, a fire that would be almost impossible to stop once it got going. Then he took a lantern from the hook near the door, lit it with a match from the box Crenshaw kept in the storage area, and placed it carefully on the floor near the pile of rags. He adjusted the wick so it burned high and hot, then tipped the lantern slightly so that oil began to leak from the base, creating a small pool on the wooden floor. It would take time for the fire to start, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30, depending on how quickly the oil spread and how hot the lantern burned. Long enough for Thomas to be far away when it happened, long enough for it to look like an accident. A lantern left burning, oil leaking, a careless mistake that anyone could have made, but Thomas wasn't finished. He needed Crenshaw in the barn when the fire started, and for that he needed bait. He left the barn and walked to the overseer's cottage. The windows were dark now. Crenshaw had gone to bed, probably passed out from the whiskey. Thomas picked up a small stone from the ground and threw it at the window, hard enough to make a sharp crack against the glass. He waited. Nothing happened. He threw another stone and another, each one hitting the window with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet night. Finally, a lamp flickered to life inside the cottage. Thomas saw Crenna's silhouette Wet moved past the window, tall and lean, swaying slightly. A moment later, the door opened and Krenaw stepped out on to porch, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was wearing only his pants and an undershirt, his feet bare, his hair disheveled. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice slurred from the whiskey. "Show yourself or I'll shoot." Thomas stepped into the light of Krenaw's lantern, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. He pointed toward the tobacco barn, then made frantic gestures, his face twisted in apparent panic, his mouth moving as if he was trying to speak but couldn't. Crenshaw squinted at him, trying to understand. What are you trying to say, boy?" Thomas pointed again, more urgently this time, then started walking toward the barn. He looked back at Crenshaw, beckoning him to follow, his gestures becoming more frantic, more desperate. Crenshaw hesitated. He was drunk and suspicious, and he didn't trust Thomas, but he was also responsible for the plantation in Edmund Harrow's absence. And if something was wrong in the tobacco barn, if there was a problem with the crop, if someone was stealing, if there was a fire, he would be held accountable. He couldn't afford to ignore a warning, even if it came from someone he hated. "This better not be a trick," he muttered, following Thomas across the yard. He kept the pistol pointed at Thomas's back, his finger on the trigger, ready to shoot if the young man tried anything. They reached the barn and Thomas pulled open the door. Inside, everything looked normal. The tobacco leaves hung in neat rows, swaying slightly in the breeze from the open door. There was no sign of fire, no smell of smoke, just the usual smell of tobacco and dust and old wood. Krenaw stepped inside, holding his lantern high. "What the hell are you playing at, boy? There's nothing." Thomas pointed toward the back of the barn, toward the storage area. His face was still twisted in panic, his gestures still frantic. Krenaw walked in that direction, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, his lantern casting wild shadows on the walls. Thomas didn't follow him. Instead, he stepped back out of the barn and closed the door. There was a heavy wooden beam that could be dropped across the door to secure it from the outside, normally used to keep animals out during the winter. Thomas dropped it into place now, locking Krenaw inside. He heard Krenaw shout, heard him run back toward the door and start pounding on it. But Thomas was already walking away, back toward his cabin, his face expressionless in the moonlight. Behind him in the storage area at the back of the barn, the leaking lantern had finally ignited the pool of oil on the floor. The flames spread quickly, catching the oil-soaked rags, the dried straw, the broken pieces of wood. Within minutes, the fire was climbing the back wall, reaching toward the dried tobacco leaves hanging above. The leaves caught fire like paper, sending embers floating up toward the roof, and the fire spread horizontally as well, racing along the racks, consuming everything in its path. Krenaw smelled the smoke before he saw the flames. He stopped pounding on the door and spun around, his lantern casting wild shadows on the walls. At the far end of the barn, an orange glow was spreading, growing brighter by the second, accompanied by a sound like wind rushing through trees, the sound of fire consuming dry wood and tobacco. He ran toward the back of the barn, thinking he could put out the fire before it spread. But by the time he reached the storage area, the flames were already too high, too hot. He tried to stamp them out with his boots, but the fire had caught the tobacco leaves now, and they were burning like paper, sending embers floating up toward the roof. The heat was intense, unbearable, and the smoke was thick and black, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. Crenshaw ran back to the door and threw his weight against it, but the beam held firm. He shouted for help, but his voice was lost in the roar of the flames. The barn was filling with smoke now, thick and choking, and he could feel the heat on his skin, could see the flames spreading across the ceiling, consuming the support beams. He looked around desperately for another way out. There were windows high up on the walls, but they were too small to climb through, and they were too high to reach without a ladder. The back wall had a loading door, but it was secured from the outside with a chain and padlock. He was trapped. The fire was spreading faster now, racing along the walls, consuming the dried tobacco, the wooden racks, the support beams. The heat was intense, unbearable. Crenshaw's lungs burned with every breath. His eyes were streaming with tears from the smoke. He could feel his skin blistering from the heat. He made one more attempt to break down the door, slamming his shoulder against it with all his strength. The wood cracked, but didn't give way. He tried again and again until his shoulder was numb with pain and he could barely lift his arm, and then through the smoke and the flames he saw something that made his blood run cold. Near the back of the barn, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the fire, was a figure, a young man with dark eyes and a face that showed no emotion at all. Thomas, but that was impossible. Thomas was outside. Thomas had locked him in. Thomas couldn't be inside the barn. Creno blinked, trying to clear the smoke from his eyes. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Had it ever been there at all, or was it just the smoke, the fear, the whiskey, playing tricks on his mind? He would never know. The roof of the barn collapsed a moment later, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris down on top of him. He had time for one last scream before the flames consumed him entirely. Thomas was sitting on the steps of his cabin when the barn collapsed. He felt the vibration through the ground, saw the column of sparks shoot up into the night sky like a fountain of fire. Around him, people were emerging from their cabins, shouting, pointing at the fire, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. Within minutes, everyone on Plantation was awake. They formed a bucket brigade from the well to the barn, passing buckets of water hand to hand, but it was useless. The fire was too big, too hot. All they could do was try to keep it from spreading to the other buildings. Ruth found Thomas in the chaos. She grabbed his arm and pulled him close, her eyes searching his face. She didn't need to ask if he had done this. She could see the answer in his eyes. "Where is Crenshaw?" She signed, her hands shaking. Thomas pointed at the burning barn. Ruth's face went pale. "Is he?" Thomas nodded. For a moment, Ruth just stared at him, her mind racing. Then she made a decision. She pulled Thomas toward the main house where one of the elderly women who kept the house was standing on the porch watching the fire with wide, frightened eyes. "We need to send someone to Richmond," Ruth said to the woman, "to tell Mr. Hargrove what happened. Thomas will go." The woman nodded, too shocked to question the decision. Ruth turned to Thomas and signed quickly, urgently. "Go to Richmond now. Tell Mr. Hargrove there was a fire. Tell him you don't know where Mr. Crenshaw is. Stay in Richmond until tomorrow. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. He understood. Ruth was giving him an alibi, a reason to be away from the plantation when the fire started. If anyone asked, he had been sent to Richmond to fetch Edmund Hargrove. He couldn't have started the fire because he wasn't there. Thomas left immediately, walking down the road toward Richmond in the darkness, the glow of the fire fading behind him. He walked for 3 hours until he reached the outskirts of the city, and then he found a place to rest, a small grove of trees near the road, and waited for dawn. Back at the plantation, the fire burned through the night. By dawn, the tobacco barn was nothing but a smoking ruin, a pile of charred wood and ash. The other buildings had been saved, but the barn was gone. And with it, the entire tobacco crop that had been curing inside, and somewhere in the ashes, buried beneath the collapsed roof and the burned tobacco leaves, was the body of Virgil Crenshaw. Edmund Hargrove arrived at the plantation around noon on August 14th, having been summoned by Thomas, who had found him at his townhouse in Richmond early that morning. Hargrove was shocked and dismayed by what he found. The tobacco barn reduced to ashes, the crop destroyed, and his overseer dead. The county sheriff arrived 3 days later to investigate. He was a man named William Foster, in his 50s, with a weathered face and a practical manner. He had been sheriff for 20 years, and he had investigated dozens of fires on plantations across the county. Most of them were accidents, overturned lanterns, sparks from forges, lightning strikes. A few were deliberate, set by enslaved people as acts of resistance or revenge, but those were usually easy to identify because the perpetrators were rarely subtle about it. Foster interviewed Edmund Hargrove first, asking about the plantation's operations, about Crenshaw's habits, about any recent problems or conflicts. Hargrove told him that Crenshaw had been a good overseer, that the tobacco yields had increased significantly under his management, that there had been no major problems that he was aware of. Foster then interviewed Ruth, who told him that Thomas had seen Crenshaw go into the barn with a lantern on the night of the fire. She said that Thomas had been working late in the carpenter shop, and he had seen Crenshaw stumbling slightly, as if he had been drinking. A few minutes later, Thomas had seen smoke coming from the barn. He had run to get help, but by the time he got back, the fire was too big to stop. And then Ruth had sent him to Richmond to fetch Mr. Harrow. Foster interviewed several other enslaved people, and they all told the same story. Crenshaw had been drinking. He had gone into the barn to check on the tobacco. Somehow the fire had started. It was a tragic accident, but not an uncommon one. Foster examined the ruins of the barn, sifting through the ashes, looking for clues. He found the remains of a lantern near where the fire had started, which supported the theory that Crenoe had been carrying a lantern and had somehow dropped it or knocked it over. He found Crenoe's body burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by the pistol he had been carrying and the brass buttons from his coat. Foster wrote his report and closed the case. The fire had been an accident caused by an overturned lantern. Virgil Crenshaw had died in the line of duty trying to protect his employer's property. It was a tragedy, but there was no evidence of foul play. Crenshaw was buried in the Plantation cemetery in an unmarked grave that would be forgotten within a generation. Edmund Hargrove hired a new overseer, a gentler man named Robert Hayes, who didn't use Crenoe's brutal methods. The tobacco crop was a total loss, but Hargrove had insurance, and he was able to rebuild the barn and plant a new crop the following spring. Life on the plantation returned to something resembling normally. The enslaved people went back to their routines, working in the fields, tending the animals, maintaining the buildings, but something had changed. There was a sense of possibility now, a sense that the old order could be challenged, that men like Crenshaw were not invincible. And then, 3 weeks after the fire, something strange happened. Another fire broke out on the plantation, this time in one of the slave cabins. It was a small fire, quickly extinguished, but it was enough to make people nervous. The cabin belonged to a man named Peter, who had been one of Crenshaw's favorites, someone who had informed on other enslaved people in exchange for small privileges. The fire had started in the middle of the night while Peter was asleep. He had woken up to find his mattress smoldering, and he had managed to put it out before it spread, but the message was clear. Informers were not safe. A week later, another fire, this time in the kitchen house. Again, it was put out before it could spread, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was setting fires, and they were targeting specific people, specific places. Edmund Hargrove became convinced that the plantation was cursed. He started spending more time in Richmond, leaving the plantation in the hands of Robert Hayes. But Hayes was nervous, too. He had heard the stories about Crenshaw, about what had happened to him, and he didn't want to end up the same way. He was careful to treat the enslaved people fairly, to avoid the kind of cruelty that had made Crenoe so hated. The fires continued, small and contained, never causing serious damage, but always appearing in unexpected places. The enslaved people began to whisper among themselves. Some said it was Crenoe's ghost come back to haunt the plantation. Others said it was divine punishment for the cruelties that had been committed there. But a few people, Ruth, Marcus, Hannah, knew the truth, or at least suspected it. Ruth confronted Thomas one evening, pulling him aside after supper. "You have to stop," she signed, her hands shaking with fear and anger. "They're going to figure it out. They're going to know it's you." Thomas looked at her with those watchful, patient eyes. "I'm not setting fires," he signed. "Don't lie to me," Ruth signed back. "I know what you did to Crenshaw. I know what you're doing now. You have to stop before they catch you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he signed, "I'm not setting fires, but I'm not stopping them either." Ruth didn't understand at first. Then she realized what he was saying. The fires weren't being set by Thomas. They were being set by other people. Marcus, Hannah, maybe others. People who had seen what happened to Crenoe, who had realized that fire could be a weapon, a tool of resistance. Thomas hadn't started a rebellion. He had started an idea, and ideas once planted are almost impossible to extinguish. Marcus had set the fire in Peter's cabin, a warning to informers. Hannah had set the fire in the kitchen house, a reminder that even the main house was vulnerable. And there were others. People who had their own grievances, their own reasons for wanting to strike back at the system that oppressed them. They were careful, setting small fires that could be easily controlled. Fires that sent a message without causing catastrophic damage. But the message was clear. We are not powerless. We can fight back. By the spring of 1860, Edmund Harrove had had enough. He sold the plantation to a buyer from North Carolina and moved permanently to Richmond. The new owner lasted less than a year before he too sold the property. Unable to deal with the constant fires, the atmosphere of fear and suspicion, the sense that the land itself was hostile, the plantation changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War broke out in 1861. By the time the war ended in 1865, the main house had burned down, another mysterious fire, this one large enough to consume the entire structure. The property was abandoned, the land divided up and sold off in pieces. Thomas lived to see emancipation. He was 24 years old when the war ended, still young, still strong, still watchful. He left Virginia and traveled north, settling eventually in Philadelphia, where he found work as a carpenter. He married a woman named Clara, also deaf, and they had 3 children together. He built a good life for himself, a free life, the kind of life he had never imagined possible when he was a young man on the Harrove plantation. He never spoke about what happened on the night of August 14th, 1859. He never told anyone about how he had locked Virgil Crenshaw in the burning barn. He carried that secret with him for the rest of his life. And when he died in 1903 at the age of 62, he took it to his grave, but the story survived. It was passed down through the descendants of the people who had been enslaved at Harrove Plantation, whispered in kitchens and parlors, told and retold until it became something between history and legend. Some versions said Thomas had magical powers, that he could start fires with his mind. Others said he had made a deal with the devil. But the oldest versions, the ones closest to the truth, said simply that Thomas was a young man who had been pushed too far, who had seen too much cruelty, and who had decided that if the law wouldn't give him justice, he would take it himself. The land where the Harrove Plantation once stood is still there in the Tidewater region of Virginia, about 40 miles south of Richmond. The main house is gone. The tobacco barns are gone. The slave cabins are gone. All that remains is a stone foundation half buried in weeds and a small cemetery where Virgil Crenshaw's unmarked grave has long since been forgotten. But on certain nights when the wind is right, people who live near by say they can still smell smoke. And sometimes, if you stand very still and listen very carefully, you can hear the sound of someone pounding on a door, desperate to get out, their voice lost in the roar of flames. This mystery shows us that history is never as simple as it seems in the textbooks. The line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and revenge, is often blurred beyond recognition. Thomas was a young man who had been denied every form of justice, every form of protection, every form of humanity, and so he took matters into his own hands in the only way he knew how. Was he justified in what he did? Or did he become the very thing he was fighting against? These are questions that don't have easy answers, questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Thomas was justified in what he did, or did his actions cross a line that should never be crossed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next